Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we're really fortunate to have Robert Bednarz, professor emeritus in the Department of Geography at Texas A&M University. Bob, thanks so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
You know, it's really great to finally be able to have you on this show. And like so many other guests will say, I'm going to ask you to reflect upon your background throughout this discussion. But early on, I'd like you to consider what really might have inspired you to become a geographer. Can you comment on your childhood, where you were raised, if there was anything that related to your upbringing that sparked that interest, and then move on to your schooling, your undergraduate studies, and graduate work?
Well, I grew up in Calumet City, Illinois, which is now a suburb of Chicago, but at the time was really more of a suburb of Northwest Indiana, where there were several steel mills, oil refineries, foundries, and so forth. So it was pretty much a blue-collar town. I kind of was more interested in the science end of academics, and had an interesting experience when I was in high school, which was that the Dartmouth College freshman football coach was literally just traveling around the Chicago area, and for whatever reason wandered into my high school and asked the dean, were there football players who could be enrolled at Dartmouth and be successful? And so the dean pulled about 5 of us out of class, and we talked to the freshman football coach, and he encouraged us to apply. He had applications with him, and I was pretty skeptical because I thought there was really no way that I could afford to go to that kind of college. And he assured me that if I were accepted, they would make it possible for me to go. And to make a long story short, I was, and they did. And so when I got to college, I had 2 real interests, which were not very similar. One was chemistry, and one, for I don't exactly know why, was urban planning. And so I began sort of doing both things, but thinking probably chemistry. But eventually I encountered the geography department at Dartmouth, who had some outstanding professors, including Robert Huke.
Right. Did he do some work in the Philippines, Huke?
Yes.
He did work in rice, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, in the Green Revolution. And he and the other faculty largely recruited me, I guess you could say, not specifically, but through their teaching and interest. And so I thought, well, I'll do geography, and then I can go into urban planning, because that was one of the disciplines you could pursue, along with, sociology, economics, and so forth. So I did my degree, and then people said, you could go to graduate school, your record is good enough. So I applied to graduate school, and my best offer was at Northwestern. And at the time, they were a very good department. They were a top 10 department, quantitative, as you probably know and remember, and many other people do as well. And so my science background fit in well with that department. And so I did that, and then eventually I did some work with Michael Dacey and Dwayne Marble, who was there at the time, doing his remote sensing thing. And then eventually, after a couple of years out of school, I ended up at the University of Chicago, working with Brian Barry. And actually, that was largely because other students I knew at Northwestern told Brian Barry was giving a guest lecture, traveling up from the south side of Chicago to the north side to give a lecture. And they informed him that there was a student that had been there before, namely me, who was in the market for continued graduate studies. And so once again, he contacted me and encouraged me to apply, and I did. And so I ended up at the University of Chicago for my PhD.
Let me interrupt you just for a minute and backtrack. Do you recall the moments you had with Robert Heuck at Dartmouth, and how he might have been a unique mentor of sorts?
Well, I think in comparison, that whole department was able to make the subject come alive. They really tried to get people to think through problems. So even in exam times, they would often give us a scenario or show us a slide. You know, those were the days when we used slide projectors, and ask us to problem solve something that was on the slide or part of a scenario. We also did quite a bit of field work. Now I've forgotten the faculty member's name who ran a second level economic geography class. And although we met in the classroom, the main part of the course was to go into the field and visit different industries. So we went to the Brooklyn Naval Yard at the time was being decommissioned, and the city of New York wanted to know what to do with it. We took a trip down there, talked to the people who were actually doing the work, and we visited lumber operations on the U.S.-Canadian border. At the time, that was the time when big, huge automated dairy farms were coming into existence. And so we went out and visited one of those things. In any case, it made the subject really come alive. And also they made every effort to engage with students. So it was a relatively small department, not tiny at the time. Dartmouth only had 3,000 something students then. So no departments were really huge. In any case, they made contact with students. They were helpful. They were advisors. It was a nice environment.
And from there, you went to Northwestern, and I recall hearing that Michael Dacey was very detail-oriented. He was a stickler for details. Do you have any anecdotes you'd like to share?
Well, he had lots of funny habits. He loved for some reason loved fire engines, and so oftentimes if a fire engine went by in the middle of class, he would stop and go to the window and see what was going on. He was also an inveterate pipe smoker, and often wore sort of sandal-y kinds of shoes, and had a habit of he'd light his pipe with a wooden match, and then sort of stick the match in his shoes, in his sandal shoes. And so, as students, having a well-known senior professor with these funny little quirks was, he wasn't just quantitative, he was mathematical. And I'll recall one time in class when he was going through some proof and we were all frantically copying it down in our notebooks. And at one point, one of my fellow students said, I don't see I don't see how you jump from, from line 2 to line 3 there. And he literally said to us, you don't want me to write down all the steps, do you? At which point, of course, all of us said, yes, please. We're learning this. You know it. We don't. So he was a character.
Well, and this, it should be noted really for many of our viewers and listeners that this was an era when much of the application of quantitative methods was done by hand, with not always in computer applications. That came afterward, and you're engaged in writing on a lot of papers, writing on a lot of sheets of paper.
Yes, yes. For some of the stuff we did, we still use the old mechanical calculators, which were not computers at all, but calculators. And then we did do computer work, but of course it was with punch cards. And in fact, at the time, at least as far as anybody knew, the only statistical package that was available to do that kind of stuff was a biomedical package. So I guess epidemiologists, et cetera, who were doing medical research had developed a standard package of regression analysis and that sort of thing, and it was commercially available. So at the time we all used BMD, which was biomedical data or something to that effect. And of course, those were the good old days where you would punch up your cards and then walk to the computer center and submit them, and then hang around or go somewhere else for an hour or 2 or 3, depending on how busy the computer was, and then go back and pick up your output, and then oftentimes, find that you had left out a colon, and so then put the colon in, put it back in, go walk around for another hour or so, come back, etc.
So then you went to work with Brian Barry in Chicago, and he's certainly a giant in our discipline still. Would you care to comment on his mentorship?
Yeah, I think the thing that impressed me about him was he was busy in many different ways. He was on presidential advisory committees. He had serious external grant funding.
Like with the Ford Foundation, I think, for development in India or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Well, he did. You're right. I mean, he did international work. He did work with the Center for Urban Studies at the University of Chicago. But he had probably as many or more graduate students than any of the other faculty, many of whom were also well-known big-name geographers, Marvin Mikesell and so forth, Carl Butzer. And he always, when I was his graduate student and working with him, he always had time for me. It was when you went in to talk to Professor Barry, it wasn't a lot of chit chat. He wanted you to get down to business, but nevertheless, he was available. His door was open. So I found him to be, a pretty amazing, outstanding scholar, and was happy to be able to work for him.
And I should probably interject one more comment, and that is, he had really achieved a relatively high status. He was really considered to be a luminary at a very young age. So when you were a student, he was still relatively young compared to his colleagues.
Yeah, and he was an active member of the department. So wasn't a solitary scholar who holed up in his office and didn't interact. So I thought I was lucky to have the chance to work with him.
I'm sure you were. He certainly had a reputation for not tolerating mediocrity. That's for sure.
Yeah, he was just. I mean, it goes without saying, you don't get to be a giant in the field by being unproductive, but he was just amazingly productive. And he helped his graduate students. I never felt I really got good instruction in grant proposal writing, but I did get good instruction in putting together and publishing papers, which is just as important, if maybe not more important, although maybe in today's world, external funding is the name of the game, but nevertheless.
Do you recall? Go ahead.
It was really a good experience at the University of Chicago.
Do you recall any other students in the department that were your peers, other doctoral students in particular, that have gone on into the field?
That is kind of a funny thing. Of the people I knew, one person was from upstate New York, and his goal in life was to go back to upstate New York and spend a lot of time fishing and and being out in the outside. And I think he actually did eventually get a position at one of the State University New York systems. Another person finished his PhD, but then went on and got a degree in law and practiced environmental law. And another one of my best friends worked originally for the federal government in their synfuels program. I don't know if you remember that. This was the day when the oil embargo and stuff
post 73
had just happened and finished. And then he went on and established his own consulting company. So it's kind of funny that hardly any of the people that I associated with became sort of run-of-the-mill standard geography professors in PhD granting universities. Another guy worked for the Chicago Transit Authority, or maybe it was the Regional Transit Authority, nevertheless. So he was not an academic. Another went on to work for the national labs, Argonne National Lab. So it is kind of funny. I was one of the few people who actually went into a standard academic career.
And
of course, I met Sarah there, Bednarz, and she eventually became a regular faculty member.
Well, that makes your graduate experience even better.
Yeah, I often reflect on what I might have done otherwise, and one thing that makes me happy that I didn't do something otherwise is I wouldn't have met Sarah Bednarz.
Indeed.
Or Sarah Witham at the time.
So from Chicago, you went where?
So those were the days when it was kind of the end of the mass increase in geography growth and university growth. So I think I applied to 50 places looking for a job.
And with the Chicago PhD, that seems kind of unusual.
Yeah. And actually, the University of Michigan was celebrating their 50th anniversary as a department. And Brian Berry and I had co-authored a paper, and he was invited to attend the 50th anniversary. And so he said, I don't really have anything ready. Why don't we just do the presentation of the paper that we just finished writing? So he invited me to come along, and so I got to associate with a bunch of big name geographers who were also invited to the meeting, including John Hudson, who was at Northwestern.
And he hadn't been at Northwestern when you were there earlier, was he?
No, he was not. He was, I think, at Wisconsin at the time.
Right.
In fact, he came and gave a guest lecture when I was a student there. And they had a job opening, and he asked me, he said, why haven't you applied to the job at Northwestern? And I had been there as a student, and I thought, I was a quantitative geographer, but I was a statistical kind of guy and an urban geographer, not really a mathematical person. And so I told him that, and he said, "Nah, you should apply. So I did, and I got an interview, and so I ended up at Northwestern for my first job.
And how long were you at Northwestern?
For 4 years. Again, given the nature of the economy in the United States at the time, everybody who wasn't pumping oil was broke, and everybody who was pumping oil was rich. And so every year there were, if you could keep your budget from the previous year, that was a huge success. Otherwise, you were asked to make cuts of 10%, 5%, or whatever. So at one point, the department at Northwestern decided that they had to downsize, and people who did not have tenure would not be renewed. When the department head came in to tell me, I said, "So you're firing me?" He said, "No, we're not firing you. We're just not renewing you."
Well, was that Hudson?
It's pretty much like the same to me.
Yeah.
That was Michael Dacey at the time.
Oh, Michael Dacey was chair then?
Yes. So,
Yeah.
So of course, as I said, the places that had money were Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, to a certain extent, California. And so one of the places I applied to was Texas A&M. And so I ended up at Texas A&M in a period of time when they were expanding and sort of asking me, well, if you were to come to Texas A&M, what kind of program would you like to establish? How could we grow into something better? And at the time, that was a pretty fantastic kind of situation where for 4 years we had been worrying about what we were going to lose and how we were going to shrink. And now all of a sudden I had an opportunity to go somewhere where we could start something new, and the program was growing and prospering. So
was Campbell Pennington still there when you got there?
Campbell Pennington was the department head, and another geography character referred to me and other people as young sir. But again, a person who was academically accomplished and productive.
And he allowed you to do what you wanted to do. He didn't. Yeah, he didn't require you to engage in any particular bit of research, did he?
No, and what he did do was he made contacts for. So Campbell was politically very astute. Geography again was small. I think when I got there were 8 people. We were in a college of geosciences: geography, geology, geophysics, oceanography, and meteorology. And so Campbell knew to survive, he had to be not only academically good, but he had to keep enrollments up or growing, and he had to show geography's value to other people on campus. So he made it his policy to go around the campus and get to know people and raise their awareness of what geography was and what we were doing and so forth. And then for me and other young people, he put us in contact with other people around the campus that could be helpful in terms of collaborative work. So, for example, he had good friends in the business school and in finance. And I had done work on property values, and which included property taxes and tax assessment. And the finance department was looking for somebody who could teach a course on local government finance. And they didn't have anybody, and they only had one or two courses. So they didn't really want to hire somebody. They didn't want to spend a position on that topic. So he introduced me to the department head, and we talked about what courses I had taken as a graduate student. And he said, well, I think you could teach this course. So for, I think, the first 3 years I was at Texas A&M, one of my teaching requirements was to teach local government finance. So I was teaching in both geography and the Department of Finance. And he also made an effort to put me in touch with people in the urban planning department. And I served on lots of committees, graduate committees in the department, and made contacts so that those faculty could also serve on geography department committees. So he was an excellent department head, and did succeed in growing the department and keeping us in business and defending us and so on and so forth.
Well, having those relationships with other departments in an amicable manner really enhances the discipline status. For not only is it able to demonstrate and showcase its value, but if you have people who are willing to engage in that relationship building, you're known as a bunch of friendly individuals who others can work with, which really benefits the discipline considerably, which is difficult in an academic institution.
Yes, and it opened up a lot of opportunities. For example, way back when, and I see it's come up again, high-speed rail was a topic in Texas at the time, and they actually put together a committee to look at the possibilities, the economics, and marketing, and so on and so forth. So I got to be part of that group. Then when there was a proposal to build a superconducting super collider in Texas, and they were looking at different sites. And once again, because through contacts in urban planning and in the business school, I was invited to participate in that effort. So people always say geography is inherently kind of interdisciplinary, and so to have the opportunity to work with other people through, as you pointed out, friendly contacts and making yourself and your department known to other people proved to be valuable and interesting, and made my job more fun.
Would you care to offer a comment on how your research has evolved and your teaching as well throughout your career?
Yeah, so I started out as an urban economic geographer, and I guess that was what I did for about 20 years at least. I kind of always had an interest in education. I think to a certain extent anybody who goes into college teaching has some interest. And then, so I pursued that, and was reasonably productive and successful in that regard. And then, actually, another one of those interdisciplinary contacts proved to be a pivot point in my career, and that was Jim Crockett, who was a PhD geographer out of the University of Washington, probably got his degree in, I would say, maybe 1970, 72, something like that. But he was interested in geographic education, and so had a position at Texas A&M in the School of Education in the Department of Curriculum Instruction. And he got me involved in some projects and on some committees of his students who were doing geographic education. And so my interest in geographic education was sparked to some extent through that activity. And then eventually the editorship of the Journal of Geography came up. And at the time, the department head was Rick Giardino, who also had a little bit of an interest, kind of secondary interest in geographic education. And we noted that it was available, and we wondered if it would be something that Texas A&M would be interested in our department and so on. And so to make a long story short, I applied for and became the editor of the Journal of Geography. And that really sort of encouraged me to move my primary interest into geographic education.
That was like in the mid to late 80s, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
And the journal at the time was kind of, I think it was kind of suffering at the time. And so we tried to introduce lots of new ideas to rejuvenate it, including we invested in software so we could actually compose the journal on site. And so we would not only receive papers. At that time, most of them were either on paper or on a computer disk, and then send them out for review and all that kind of stuff. But then once the papers were edited and ready for publication, we actually would put the issues together on a computer in the department and then deliver a disk with in essence, the finished journal to printers, and all the printer really did was print it. So we did the whole thing. So I learned a lot about composition and as well as editing and reviewing and all that kind of stuff.
Well, and that was an antecedent of sorts to your later editorial duties, I guess.
Yeah. Yes. So after a while, it was a job that was interesting, and I liked it. But at the time, the journal was publishing 6 issues a year, so it was almost a constant deadline. And anytime you weren't working on it, the manuscripts were accumulating and so on and so forth. So after 8 or 9 years, I finally decided that I had to stop this and get on with the rest of my life. And I was kind of surprised, but really honored when a bunch of old geoeducation veterans put together a special session at an NCGE meeting in my honor as departing editor. So I think all I'm saying is I think we managed to rejuvenate the Journal of Geography, and I think it had a good run afterwards. So.
Well, that's good. That's good. I think certainly your academic record, or your record in the academy, speaks for itself, and of course that devotion to geographic education is very important. I think the first paper I presented at an AAG meeting was at a geographic education session that was attended by you and Sarah, but I think it was chaired by Elaine Bazowski from Villanova, who the Pennsylvania Geographical Society has an award given in her honor. But I think that might have been the first time I met you and Sarah, and you had said some kind words that have stuck with me. You probably don't remember it at all because you've done this so often, but that was in the mid-'80s when you had just taken over the editorship. And I remember making a comment on an article that Preston James had written a couple decades before that you and your wife commented should be republished in the Journal of Geography, which was. It was actually republished.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways we tried to get some notoriety for the journal was we tried to invite well-known geographers to, in some cases, reprise one of their previous contributions. So we got Saul Bellow to do that, and we got Brian Barry to do it, and other people who I don't remember right at the time, but it proved to be a really interesting, valuable thing, and made their work accessible to lots of people who might not have otherwise seen it, because there's a number of the recipients of the journal were K-12 teachers,
right?
And those guys took pains to write in a way that to make their work accessible to everybody. I remember Saul Bellows in particular, and this was really before all the nation states began to disintegrate. But he wrote a really interesting paper that we published talking about how supranational organizations made it possible for small states to disassociate themselves from large countries. So his argument was, if you're Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, to go out to leave the Soviet Union sort of on your own, you're just a little tiny place, and it might be a pretty scary world out there with all the big powers. But if you could be in the umbrella of a supranational organization, the United Nations, the European Union, or something like that, then you had the opportunity to declare your own independence while not giving up the power of a large-scale organization behind you, something like a country. And so he talked about the possibility of Scotland and Wales and this dissolution of the Soviet Union, all really before it happened. So it was really a nifty paper.
Well, it's, again, further validation to your strategy that revisiting these articles has great value.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
and Harm de Blay, now, as you having said that, also talked about, he had worked a lot on ocean cruises. And he talked about being on one in which for some reason they couldn't get up-to-date weather information. And the ship captain was kind of concerned about their path to their next port and whether they should try to divert or if there was some serious weather. So Harm described how knowing something about climate and weather enabled him to help the ship captain avoid some hurricane weather and keep the ship in good shape. So that was another example of a well-known old-time geographer, contributing to a journal that many people might not consider contributing to. But it worked out great.
Well, he was certainly a great geographer, that's for sure. He had his feet on the ground in more countries than most.
Yeah, and he he was able to bring geography to people who had no idea what geography is, other than what the state capitals are, how tall the mountains.
Mm-hmm. As Good Morning America's geographer.
Exactly.
As well as doing other things. Well, we have about a minute to go here, Bob. I'm going to ask you to reflect on your life, as I already have, but to consider the things that you have learned over the past decades, really. And you see where geography is heading. You've encountered numerous students, undergraduates and graduate students and colleagues, and I'm wondering if you could provide some words of advice for prospective students in geography, maybe graduate students, but certainly also colleagues in geography. Can you share with us your thoughts?
Well, certainly something I always told graduate students was to really take time and be careful in choosing an advisor or a mentor, and to find somebody whose work you found interesting and you could collaborate with. In my experience, the graduate students who were not successful were people who were capable, but for one reason or another simply didn't finish the research that was necessary for them to earn their degree. And I recall many discussions with students, and they would say, well, I'm working with Professor so-and-so, and he wants me to do this, but I don't want to do that. I want to do this instead. And my attitude always was, think real hard about that, because if you do something your advisor wants you to do, they're invested in your success. They're interested in your success. When you come in with the latest results, they want to know what those results are, because they're part of the project. They're part of whereas if you're doing something that isn't very related to that person's interests, it's very easy for them to put it aside and do their own work or continue on their own project that has more interest for them. So for graduate students, I think having a good advisor and sort of, I guess you could say, kind of weaseling your way into their research project, I think is really a route for success. And I would always advise students to do that. And I think, of course, the university situation, the discipline has changed tremendously in the amount of time that I spent in higher education. I guess I started in 1974 and retired in 2017. So that's 40-something years. But obviously, I think at major research universities, being able to secure outside funding is just so important. And among other things, it allows you to support graduate students, which I think in today's world is very important for success for young faculty and old faculty as well. So I think paying attention to where funding opportunities are and how you can get into that game is the way to go.
Well, thank you, Bob, for sharing those thoughts with us. I really appreciate you taking the time to consider those things, because those are not the same pieces of advice that many people will be willing to share, and they're valuable for sure. Thank you also for spending this time with us. It has been an enjoyable half hour or so.
It has.
And I'm really glad that you're able to do this, because your insight really lends quite a bit to the history of geography, as we record this oral history of our discipline.
Well, it's good that you're taking the effort to do this. It must be quite a responsibility on your end as well.
I like doing it as well, so that's good. Anyway, well, thank you once again.
It's my pleasure.
This concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.